Certainly, I would mention that, we would talk about that, and whether we want to be supportive and put that in the paper, and then you could decide when the first public comment comes back to the board.
Then the second part of my question that I had is, back in June, I requested, that we reinitiate an MOU with the Fire Safety Council, because this is where a lot of this stuff comes from, and they work with Milford and Zanesville and Blue Valley, et cetera, to do a lot of these projects, and I'm just curious on where we're at with that, because I haven't seen any progress made to get a new MOU with the Fire Safety Council that helps facilitate all this stuff with the grant writing that a lot of these small communities can't do by themselves. They need that next level of support and help. And I don't know, I'm just curious on where we're at with that. Are we just gonna abandon it and say, well, it was nice at the time, or are we gonna continue on to help facilitate this stuff? Because this Title III stuff, it helps to leverage money. You gotta have these grant writers, and somebody like Little Valley, or some of these other smaller communities, they don't have that in-house grant writer, whereas the Fire Safety Council, they have all that expertise, and they know how to leverage the money to make this money work and to grow and compound and leverage it. And, without this, now we're just gonna, we're kind of, some other people might be missing the opportunity.
All I know about the MOU that the Fire Safety Council it was done in 2006, it's a multi-agency document, and that was actually prepared by the Fire Safety Council and brought to that committee. I wasn't part of that process, that's just what I know.
Okay. Well, I'd like to see progress made so we can get that.
Well, it lapsed, and 2 years later, everybody discovered it, so I think
Right.
the initiative is on their part. If they want to re-engage, then I think they need to come forward to all the agencies, including the county, and say, we'd like to renew this agreement.
Well, as manager of the money, shouldn't we be helping facilitate that too?
If it's the direction of the board, we can send them a letter asking whether or not they're interested in renegotiating the MOU.
We can do that, but I mean, they're like everybody else, it's public notice, and they
Well,
can, like anybody.
But I think underlying the issue, the reason why they walked out of the room is because the board had the audacity to ask them for some accountability and for the documents and their audits and their financial records and stuff like that, so they would be available to the general public. And they were not at all happy about the idea of doing that. And when they did provide what they had up through the time of the MOU, but after the MOU expired, they said there was no obligation to do it. So I think the reason why it wasn't a push on their part to renew the MOU is that they didn't want to have to comply with the public disclosure requirements. And I mean, they made it real clear, they're a private nonprofit, and what they do is their business, and we told them that, if you're gonna accept public money, you have to provide the accountability for it, and that sort of kind of created a rub there. So if that's subsided and they're willing to provide all those disclosure documents and so forth, I'd say, hey, let's re-engage with them, but I think it requires them to step forward. The reason why it isn't today in place is because they're not in the room, because they've chosen not to be in the room, not because we're not in the room.
Well, I think we ought to extend the invitation back to them.
Yeah, we can do that, Marty, why don't you send a letter to them, extend the invitation, that, if they're interested, be sure they do know about and aware of it. Okay, anybody else in the public wish to speak? If not, we're gonna vote on this. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. The ayes have it. Okay, we're gonna move on to, 10 o'clock item, juvenile hall report, which is continued to next week. Is there anybody here that wishes to speak on the juvenile hall today? Come forward, ma'am. It's gonna be continued.
It's gonna be continued, so we're not gonna make the report today.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, Jen Browning with the probation department. Yesterday I received a letter from the Board of State and Community Corrections regarding some technical assistance that they provided in looking at the juvenile hall to find out the feasibility of the co-located facility. I apologize for getting it to you just this morning, but there was no way to get it to you at like 5 o'clock last night. So I just wanted to make sure to pass that out so that you guys have that in order to consider. I've got my So that was all I wanted to do.
Okay, thank you.
It had been continued to next week.
Okay, those of you in the juvenile hall We are gonna continue this item to next Tuesday. If you wanna speak on it today, you're welcome to at this time, but any decision by the board is gonna be continued till next Tuesday. So I see Ken here and, several of you. If you wanna speak on it now, you sure may.
Okay,
Ken?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a handout for the board. I know that you haven't received this. Unfortunately, the timeliness of some information was a little short.
Let's give you another week.
Well, maybe. Thank you, my name's Ken Theobald. I'm here as chairman of the Juvenile Justice Commission. I have several of the commission members are also here. Did I miss
We
one?
didn't give us enough, no. We need a couple more.
A couple more?
I need one. You didn't need one.
Yeah, more can, I think we got three more.
Good thing I have a lot of paper. Everybody got one? You all have received a packet from Marty, thank you, that outlines the dollars as far as juvenile hall goes. In that packet is also a letter from Judge Federosa. I've given you a letter of the commission's feelings concerning the hall. I didn't go back over all the numbers, I didn't feel that was necessary. As we do have some new board members though, I also gave you an outline of what the commission does and the members of the commission, so that just to give you a little background on that. And, you know, the commission has looked at the pluses and minuses for a long time, as does the supervisors, as to running juvenile hall. It is our feeling that, keeping juvenile hall open is a huge importance to this community. There's lots of issues of keeping it open, not only dollar issues, but issues with the children and with the families associated with that, associated with law enforcement, things that we just can't always put dollar figures on. Juvenile hall was never intended to make money. If it was intended to make money, there's lots of areas around the county that we could stop things that don't bring in any revenue, and that would give us some paybacks also. So I do have, I think, one other member that wants to make a comment, but I'm here to answer questions also. I think closing juvenile hall would be a real detriment to this community. I know that will happen. There's lots of issues with juveniles, and over the years, we've seen the occurrence of recidivism decrease in our community. The more that occurs, the long-term payback of that is huge for us as a society, and huge for those kids that do not end up in the system, as you all know. So we recommend that you not close the hall. Obviously, that's why we're here. So questions that you might have of the commission?
Board have any questions for Ken? Not this time.
Okay. Unfortunately, it's been continued because we had some timing issues today. I cannot be here next Tuesday, although some other commissioners, I'm sure, will be here that could answer questions also. I'm not sure, Bruce, did you want to come up?
Just briefly. Thank you. I'm Bruce Davey, and I'm on the Juvenile Justice Commission. And formerly, our family had a business here in Susanville, automotive business there, on Main Street across from the high school. And one of the things that it's hard to quantify on a yearly basis, but we typically would have $10,000 to $20,000 a year in profit loss to things like vandalism and crime. And the effect of the juvenile hall on reducing juvenile crime and the deterrent effect that it's had has been a benefit. We're no longer in business, but I'm sure that those who remain on Main Street or anywhere else where they're experiencing vandalism appreciate a lower level of crime. So that's a part of what you're buying with the deterrent effect of the juvenile hall. And I think one of the other things I'd just like to kind of emphasize after being in the hall and going through the inspections, and that is that the level of criminality that our kids have been involved in to end up in juvenile hall, I believe is far less sophisticated than that which they will encounter if they're put in out-of-county placements. If we were to close the hall, those kids would end up in places where their peer inmates have engaged in much more sophisticated criminal acts, and we would be escalating the education of that criminality by putting them out of county. I think that's a huge disadvantage and a loss of a valuable tool to have our own hall here. So those are some of the major things I'd like to stress, and I'll move on and not take any more of your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Anybody else wish to speak on the juvenile hall?
Thank you.
Nobody, so this will be,
I have a couple questions and maybe a comment, and if Ken could stick around for the comment, I would hope he could, but I have a question for Jennifer for staff. And this goes to the staff report that Marty has part of the agenda packet. And on page 2, it talks about an average of 8 juveniles a month will need to be housed in a facility. If it's not here, it's got to be somewhere. And so all the numbers are based on the 8. And then later on page 3, it talks about the city of Susanville arrests 3 juveniles per month. And if the hall is closed, of course, it makes it sound like the city has this independent responsibility for taking care of the juveniles. So I didn't, until I read this memo, I've never understood the city as having a distinct and separate obligation when it came to juvenile delinquency. And so, you know, if that's the case, historically they've never participated in, you might say, the financial matrix that supports the juvenile hall and the juvenile program. That's always been, in my impression, has been 100% the responsibility of the county, shared with the courts in terms of the jurisdiction. And then right below that it says the sheriff, again, about 3 arrests per month in consequences similar to those in the city. So you have 3 coming from the unincorporated area, 3 coming from the incorporated area, based on what I'm reading in the model, but yet we have 8 overall. And I believe from the budget deliberations back in early September, we learned as a board that we roughly have the 8, and that we usually have a couple out-of-county placements, and then the balance is terms of our local wards that basically run afoul and need to be dealt with. So I just want to make sure that I'm interpreting what this memo is saying. So roughly we have 3 from the unincorporated areas, 3 from the incorporated areas, and then we have 2 that are housed from, in terms of out-of-county placement, coming from another county, whether it's Modoc, Loomis, or wherever.
Generally, that's kind of what the average breakdown is for that. But when we look at that, if we look at the 8 per month, we are always gonna have kids that are moving in and out of that system, because it's a continual
No,
moving piece.
and I appreciate that. It's not a static thing where you have the same 8 kids for the duration of the year.
True.
But roughly, we're dealing with 8 kids at a time, and of course then.
On average.
On an average, and then you get into the input from the other counties. And so obviously, we're gonna be talking about this next week when we can have more time on the agenda to delve into it and so forth. I just wanna back up and go to, you know, we're, according to this here right now, I mean, and it's a debatable amount, our operating cost is $1.3 million. The projected revenues is about $260,000, so the amount of general fund subsidy that comes in from a variety of sources is a little over $1 million.
Correct.
10 years ago, when this juvenile hall, the new juvenile hall was coming up and running, the board had a similar, you know, discussion and concern. We were looking at a $500,000 to $600,000 operating budget, of which the vast majority, probably 85–90% of that was being subsidized by the county general fund. I know the board had some real issues back then. I mean, if you read the memos and the documents that were attached from that era back. So in 10 years' time, we've seen this program more than double in terms of size of cost. And I think the issue, and this goes to the comment, and I appreciate Ken being here. He's a very valuable resource to the community, and I know your time is of essence. And it's fair to say it's not intended to make money. But I think it's also important that we emphasize, and this is the issue the board is dealing with, and what I hope that the dialogue that we can have next month can focus on. It's not the intent of the juvenile hall to lose money, okay? And I think what was represented back in the 90s when we built the first juvenile hall, which is a small facility, which is the part that's in front now that's been converted to a group home. And we basically got hustled as a county to build this bigger facility in the back, which is the main juvenile hall, was this regional partnership that was going to take place. And the basis of that regional partnership was that Lassen County was not going to bear the brunt of the financial responsibilities. That, yeah, we would be willing to be the host, and we'd be probably willing to take the biggest hit, because we probably have the most kids and so forth. But the dynamics of this was going to be something that was going to be shared in part, in a major way, by Plumas and Modoc County, as well as whatever other counties that we could bring to our area. And as you talk about where you can transfer kids to now, if we close the juvenile hall, we had to transport. You identify Tehama County, Yuba County, other facilities, what it would cost to go to those particular facilities to house our kids. Likewise, for the surrounding counties being able to come and bring, kids here to make this thing a financial viable implement. I'm not saying that we need to be 100%, revenue to expenditures, but the disparity between the two is historically, from the get-go, we've accepted. In fact, when we had the ribbon cutting for the original juvenile hall, those that were around will remember, I showed up, and after they ceremoniously cut the ribbon with the scissors, I took a chain and wrapped around the doors and made the point that the state gave us the money to build this. It was like $1 million or $2 million, but there was absolutely no money to operate it. And that in many respects makes no sense. And so what the regional partnership was to try to bring together, the collaboration and try to put together a facility that can meet all our needs. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is a deterioration of that partnership to the point where the financial contributions are relatively minimal from the surrounding counties and areas, and we've been bearing the cost. And that's the issue that the board focused on in terms of having this as a discussion item. Do we want to close the juvenile hall? No. Can we afford to operate a juvenile hall with no money? No. What can we do to try to make this work? The partnerships with the court. I appreciate the judge's letter. She's sincere in what she communicates. But one of the issues we've had, and it's not only with the current judge but with previous judges, is we have to have a partnership with the courts. That if you want us to provide these services, which we're more than capable of trying to provide, you need to work with us in terms of providing with us the financial resources to make it happen. You just can't say, here's the job, you do it, and you figure out how you're going to pay for it, and our hands are washed. So I think the dialogue that we wanted to have with this study session, and hopefully we can get into next week, Mr. Chairman, is how we put this back together again. I'm not saying that it's going to be 100% funded by the county, or it's going to be zero funded by the county. But we need to identify how we can strengthen it. Now, this new facility was built for 40 beds, and after a period of time, it became obvious that we didn't have the participation with all these supposed partners that were going to generate the revenue, so we mothballed it. We basically have cut off the facility, cut it in half, and we've mothballed half, and now we're operating a 20-bed facility with an average of 8 kids per bed. Now, if you think about it, $1.3 million divided by 8 as an average. It doesn't matter how many kids you rotate into that 8 slot, but that's a heck of a lot of money per kid being spent. The prison out here gets criticized for spending, $45,000, maybe $50,000 per inmate. The sheriff, when it comes to incarcerating, somebody in the adult detention facility, is proud when they can do it for $28,000 or $29,000. It might be up a little bit now because of the AB 109 factor and so forth. But we're talking about, pushing close to $150,000 to $200,000 per kid when it comes to this juvenile hall. That's the issue that we need to adopt or attack or deal with in terms of focusing on our energies. Now, maybe what we need to do is get the group home out of the old juvenile hall, convert it back to a small juvenile hall that operates for 8 kids or 10 kids or maybe 12 kids, and take the 40-bed facility, turn it over to the sheriff and allow him to be part of the mix of what he's trying to deal with and grapple with as far as AB 109. We still have a juvenile hall. The question is, do we have the juvenile hall that we have right now? Those are the issues I think, Mr. Chairman, the board was really interested in focusing on. So you've answered the question as to the numbers. Hopefully we can get to a point where we can have a juvenile hall, but it's not one that's costing us a whole lot, that we're losing a whole lot, or one that we're supposing, not making a whole lot of money on. So.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Ken, I'll take my comment, and then Larry.
Thank you for Thank you for letting me speak again. And Mr. Chapman, thank you for your comments. I want to bring us back, though, to the point that it's not 1.3 million, and I understand it's just a little one, it's just a little over $1 million after that cost. The other thing I'd like the board to, and unfortunately I can't be here next Tuesday, to review is on Marty's page 2, where you start taking a look at the cost to transport these kids if we were to close the hall. You're looking at somewhere between page 2 and page 3, $900,000 to $950,000 to transport the 8 kids, if that's the level we stay at, to other facilities. Not taking into account, how would you like to be the person driving on the roads the last 2 weeks? To take these kids to other counties. And when I talk about some things we can't monitor, someone's going to die one of these days on the road. It's going to happen. That's a huge thing. Getting back to taking the old juvenile hall over, there's a huge amount of problems with that facility being a juvenile hall. The construction of it was never meant to be a full-time juvenile hall. The construction of that building does not meet the needs of the kids and or the staff. And if you were to look at that, I challenge you to talk to the staff and others about the construction of that place. You know, what it was a holding facility for a weekend. That's what it was. And the reality is, that's not much of a holding facility. So, you know, there's a lot of issues here to be looked at. Not all of them can be put into dollars, but I think you want to look at how much the cost would be if we close it and or cut it back to where it was before. We're still going to be transporting these kids, or we're going to be turning them loose on the streets. Programs have worked. Yeah, hindsight is great, but juvenile issues are down, not just because of juvenile hall, but that plays a big role in it. What's the payback for that? With the numbers start going up, your numbers of the cost of transporting those kids and providing services to them out of county are going to go up tremendously, more than what you're looking at now. So when you get to that point, I hope you keep that in mind. Thank you.
So we got that comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jones. I had a quick question that predates, me here by a decade or so. In May of '98, the $2 million that we got for the juvenile hall, was that all used to build this structure? Yeah, okay. And I think just a point I wanted to make, that the reason or how this came to be, and I really appreciate everybody, all the time that everybody's put into building a case, why we need to keep the juvenile hall. And I would hope that between now and next week that we look at it more than just two decisions. Do we keep it going or do we close it? I think some energy should be put toward how could we maybe reduce the cost of operating. And I think because I just want the community to realize this came to be because, as it stated, it's a little over $1 million of general fund money. And $1 million represents a huge portion of our discretionary general fund money to spend. Basically, 8 kids on average a month, or 96 kids per annum. I mean, that represents only a small fraction of 1% of the population.
Well, to build on it, if I could comment, Mr. Chairman.
Remember, we are continuing this on.
We are, but to comment on that point, I think it's a significant point. 1 year of operating the juvenile hall, okay, I mean, to put it in perspective, I think we need to figure out how to contain costs and bring it down. But 1 year right now of funding juvenile hall would pay 5 years of our commitment, of our 15-year commitment for the new pool authority, to put it into perspective. I mean, if you want to look at that, and I'm saying, you got 8 kids that are benefiting here, and you got a community benefits there. The amount of grief and upset that we took over proposing the audacity idea that we were going to spend $200,000 to support this new JPA, and where's the money going to come from? How are we going to afford to do it? And that consumed a lot of time in this boardroom but we don't even blink an eye at the idea that in order to fund this program, so in 3 years' time, with the juvenile hall, our fiscal commitment with this JPA would be totally satisfied. So in terms of perspective, that's what I'm saying, is we need to bring things back to, we need to take care of the juvenile needs, but we need to also manage those costs.
This discussion is basically for people who will not be able to return. You guys. can
Exactly.
No, I
You
just
guys can
want,
argue next time.
I'm not arguing.
Well, it is for the purpose of the benefit of people who can't be here next week.
No, my point that I was making was to try and, look, the need for juvenile hall has been, it seems to obviously be a real one. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of feedback and time that's gone into it. All that I'm trying to say is, to point out is that although it is important, it serves the needs of a fraction of 1%. But what I'm saying is, I would hope that the same energy and effort could be put into maybe helping, maybe lessen the cost of running the juvenile hall. Just some energy put into that. It's not just gonna be to keep it open or keep it closed. Let's have a third component, which is how do we keep it and serve the needs of the community and reduce the cost somewhat. And that's what I hope. That's what I want.
Make it financially viable.
Anybody else wish to speak on this before we move on?
I'd just like to make a
Oh,
comment.
wait, we got a guy behind you.
Is there anybody from,
Is there anybody from Plymouth here? From out of town? Everybody here is local. Go ahead, sir.
Rich Duvarney, Lassen County Superintendent of Schools. I have an interest because we run the educational facility within the juvenile hall. I have many random thoughts here, but basically, over the last few years, actually quite a few years, with the average, we're funded on the average daily attendance. And so 5 or 6 years ago, there were more like 17, 18 students in there, but probably 6, 7 years ago. And then it really dropped. We had, I'm not sure why the number went so low, but it seems like there's more like 12 in there now. I'm there quite often with our educational facility. So, and then the other thing that has in the education realm is we've lost money year after year on the juvenile hall, but with the implementation of the local control funding formula, which is the new education funding formula, we will actually be in the black for juvenile hall. So we have more funding than we've had previously. So with that in mind, I think, in agreement with Mr. Chapman and Mr. Wasik, I think working together to see, maybe other revenue sources to help juvenile hall, and then just improving our program, both educationally and in other ways, to possibly bring those folks from other counties and get them to see, hey, we have a quality program here that we can really help their kids, and so get the other counties to send their kids to us. So there's tremendous, even like just looking from the law enforcement standpoint, flash incarcerations and having a student go in, or youth go in there for the weekend, come out on Monday and go back to school, kind of tune them up and they're ready to go. I mean, that saves the schools a lot of grief as far as behavior, and it's great working with probation and law enforcement to really help those kids to get on the straight and narrow in a very short period of time, rather than looking at AB 109 and looking at the sheriff. If we don't take care of these kids now, and then the sheriff is dealing with them in the facility when they're adults. So just to take those things in mind, and I think maybe even having a subcommittee to study this issue, see where we can get financing, see how we can improve our program, and maybe even just kind of alter the way we do things in juvenile hall. So, thank you.
Anybody else wish to speak at this time? Alan?
Alan Schumacher, I'd just like to question, learning about costs. Are the parents being billed for any of this juvenile delinquency costs?
I can't answer that. I would say no.
Well, aren't we responsible for our kids? Bill them.
It's based on a sliding scale fee to where if somebody qualifies for a waiver, the fee is waived to 0. And that's been in effect for ever since I started at the probation department.
Is that the courts that do that?
That's the county system that does that.
Do we have the ability to?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I've never heard of that. I mean, in terms of waiving I thought the courts controlled all that.
Could we add that to our talk next week?
Discuss that.
Well, I think it's a valid question that's raised, and since they're all here, I think the answer, or one of the comments is addressed as item C at the bottom of page 3, and this is talking about the adverse effect of having a transport-based program. The distances and costs involved to travel to either Red Bluff or Marysville will impact the ability of families to visit their incarcerated child and possibly adverse affect their rehabilitation. So from reading that, and one of the theories that has been part of having a local-based program versus a transport program, it's not only the safety of the staff and the safety of the wards of the court, but it also is a matter of convenience for the families in terms of dealing with it. So not only do we not charge them, but we don't want to make it inconvenient for them. And one of the complaints that I've had is part of the reason why we have the delinquency in a lot of cases is because of lack of maybe parental involvement in these young people's lives. And so by making it so it's not inconvenient to the parent, I think it is a disservice. So one of the components we need to look at is how do we get their attention in terms of doing that. Maybe if they have to get on an icy road and drive to Marysville to deal with their child, that might be one way to get their attention. So keep that in mind.
And the probation department, the juvenile probation department is mandated by statutory law to provide reunification services to juveniles and their parents.
Okay, I think that answers the question. Thank you. Anybody else wish to speak on this? Again, we'll continue this to next week.
Should be a good discussion next
11
week.
o'clock.
Good
Okay?
discussion.
11 o'clock, next Tuesday, we will continue this. And I myself am not in favor of closing juvenile hall. I support it. We have to look at the cost. It's getting rather expensive. With that, we're going to move on to Planning and Building Services and Williamson Act protest of notice of non-renewal. And since I hold a contract, I will, we take 5 minutes recess.